Good morning, everyone. Can we all please rise for our national anthem? Thank you and good morning, everyone. My name is Daniela Spagnolo, and I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Ontario Cybersecurity Division of the Ontario Public Service. Today, I am honored to open up here day 2 of our Operation Defend the North. This event is not only an important exercise in how to closely contain and minimize the impact of cyber attacks, but also how to strengthen Ontario's cybersecurity readiness and response strategies. I offer my sincere thanks to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and to CyberX for putting on this event and for championing cybersecurity across the province and our country. And also to you, the dedicated individuals and partner organizations, the participants and all our attendees, both in person and those joining us online virtually. You have come here today to take part in this event, and I thank you. Yesterday, we began our cybersecurity tabletop exercises by completing modules on breach identification and initial response, public awareness, and crisis communication, the impact on emergency services and healthcare, and impact on telecommunications. Today, we dive back in and we look at the impacts to financial markets and critical infrastructures such as utilities. Cybersecurity, as always, remains a top priority for the government. Enhancing digital resiliency means being prepared. And so today, our government recognizes the need to be able to better respond, deploy, and get involved in emergency management of cyber incidents, particularly with public sector organizations that do not have strong cybersecurity resources. Recent cyber attacks, particularly on our public sector institutions such as hospitals, and a growing use of artificial intelligence and the risks that come with it, further reinforce the need to act. That is why exercises like today's Operation Defend the North are so very important to all of us. And now, it is my privilege to introduce to you the Honourable Todd McCarthy, Minister of Public and Business Service Delivery and Procurement. Recently appointed as Ontario's Minister of Public and Business Service Delivery and Procurement, Minister McCarthy oversees the delivery of vital programs, services, and products, both in person and online, to Ontario through Service Ontario. In his role, he also oversees consumer protection laws in the province, leads Ontario's efforts in the development of public policy around groundbreaking technologies like AI, and innovates new ways to make it easier to start and run businesses on Ontario. Lastly, he is also responsible for supply chain management and procurement across the public sector, ensuring that Ontario ministries, provincial agencies, hospitals, school boards, children aid societies, and more have access to high quality, timely, reliable products that are also cost effective. In his role, Minister McCarthy is also an advocate for heightening digital resiliency across Ontario, and that's why he's here today. Minister McCarthy, I now welcome you to the stage.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and good morning to all, both here in person and joining us online. It is my distinct honor to be with you today for the second day of Operation Defend the North. A special thank you to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, CSIS, and of course CyberX for hosting this event, along with all of today's participants. I am joined today, of course, by Mohammed Qureshi, our Corporate Chief Information Officer and Associate Deputy Minister for Government Information Technology Ontario, and Daniela Spagnuolo, who kindly introduced me. She is our Chief Information Security Officer for Ontario and also Assistant Deputy Minister. David Langell, Head of the Cybersecurity Strategy, Risk Management and Architecture Branch, and Julia Lee, Senior Manager of the Cyber Security Education and Center of Excellence Unit. I would like to take a moment to open our discussions with a brief look at some of the initiatives and legislative measures that my ministry is undertaking within the realm of cybersecurity and digital trust. The Internet provides all of us with invaluable tools for learning, for business, and for entertainment. However, as technologies rapidly advance, the people of Ontario need to trust that their personal data is safe so that they can confidently and conveniently participate in today's digital world. If Ontario is going to be successful in a digital age, we need to take action. Recent cyber attacks, particularly on our public sector institutions, such as hospitals, and the growing use of artificial intelligence further reinforce why we need to act now. That is why this past month, I was very honored to introduce the Strengthening Cybersecurity and Building Trust in the Public Sector Act 2024. That included first reading on May the 27th, and second reading debate followed soon thereafter. I should add it was introduced May 13th with second reading debate commenced May 28th. Our proposed legislation is a comprehensive approach to strengthening cybersecurity in the public sector and laying a strong foundation in artificial intelligence governance, while at the same time protecting the privacy and sensitive data of all Ontarians with a strong focus on our children. Through regulations to be developed under the Act, we would propose sector-specific requirements, mandatory cyber incident reporting to government, that would be mandatory cybersecurity reporting to government, and compliance tools. These regulations will be developed through consultations with key public and private sector stakeholders and partners to help strengthen cybersecurity and prevent attacks while also being prepared and ready to respond and ensure resilience. Cyber attacks have become far too common and far too frequent. For example, we recently saw that BC government systems have been attacked just this past April. That is why it has become more crucial than ever that we reassure the people of Ontario that we are taking decisive action now and that we are prepared. Government needs to be able to better respond and deploy and become involved in emergency management of cyber incidents, particularly with respect to public sector organizations that do not have strong cybersecurity resources or defenses. That is why, through regulations, we intend to propose centralized reporting within government to empower my ministry to lead cybersecurity direction throughout the public sector. We believe that this centralized reporting is vital to increasing visibility, transparency, and an effective response. The proposed legislation would also set a foundation to better protect the data entrusted to us by the people of Ontario, with additional protections to safeguard the health and safety of youth and children. As Ontario moves forward with developing effective regulations, we will consult with key government and public sector stakeholders and experts to better protect the personal data entrusted to the public sector organizations. In entrusting it to these organizations, we must ensure that unauthorized use is prevented and to curb the impact when and if cyber attacks do occur. Our goal is to keep the people of Ontario safe from data and AI-related harms while supporting the growth of a safe and strong and prosperous digital economy. When it comes to cyber threats, we all need to work as one to keep our collective guard up and minimize our vulnerabilities. And as we proceed with next steps, it is important to address provincial needs that are not included in federal legislation in relation to cybersecurity, privacy, and AI. That is why I was honored to give opening remarks at the April 2024 Cybersecurity and Identity Summit 2024 in our nation's capital. We heard from many industry experts, business leaders, and cybersecurity professionals, all of whom discussed challenges, and they showcased solutions to help shape a secure digital future for Canada. It is a commitment that we all share at all levels of government and throughout industry across the country. It is a commitment that means learning daily, anticipating technological trends, anticipating threats, and ensuring readiness for challenges. Preparation is the key, and a primary focus of Ontario's Cybersecurity Centre of Excellence works, their efforts and their work and their dedication, a primary focus of that is to counter evolving cyber threats. So today we have a great opportunity to build on what we know and to get ready for what comes next. Exercises like these are vital to test our knowledge and our tools in emergency management of cyber incidents. It is a pleasure to see that the Ontario government, through the Cybersecurity Centre of Excellence, has been able to join with CSIS and with our public and private sector partners on this cybersecurity readiness tabletop exercise. So I thank again CyberX and all the members of our cybersecurity community who will help us sharpen our readiness and our response strategies. Together, and I emphasize together, because it is a partnership between public and private sector public servants. This is public service that we all must engage in. Together, we can continue working to make Ontario the best and safest place in the world to live, work, play, and conduct business. Please enjoy the rest of this exciting and urgently needed and critical event. And thank you for your kind attention.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Day 2 of Operation Defend the North. I'm your host, Ali Hirji, and for the next 25 minutes, we will be touching base on how far we've come at the end of Day 1 and what to expect as we go into Day 2 of this ongoing power outage, which will shortly become clear in terms of how, from a cyber perspective, how this actually has transpired. And we'll be going through a series of items, both from what we looked at yesterday, but also the sectors that are impacted today and going forward. Joined with me, I have my co-hosts Kelly Irvin as well as Mark Dillon. And around the table, we have leaders from across Canada and North America who will be helping us understand the situation at hand. Kelly, I'll start off with you first. We're into Day 2 right now, and the power outage continues. There is information trickling in about how this outage has happened. It is becoming clear, and we are sure that an incident of sorts has occurred. We don't have the specifics yet. Kelly, as we step into day 2 and the outage is now in for 24 hours, what's top of mind for you?
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Having gone through this in real life 3 times over the past 15 years, the first thing I'll say is last night I was able to sleep because this is a simulation exercise. But it made me think about when you're going through this for real, what happens to people, the emotions of people who are trying to resolve the issue, as well as all of the public who are impacted by it, is that there's extreme stress that starts to occur. When we have a power outage on a normal day, that's a blip, or that's a couple minutes, or it's maybe an hour, or sometimes you have an evening. Your family sort of says, what's going on, and what are we supposed to do without our power? And it's an inconvenience. But when it becomes obvious that it's going to be elongated, people go to funny places about how are we going to survive. And so that's what was going through my head last night as I was thinking about what happens after 5 hours, 10 hours, 15 hours, now 24 hours, is people go into a bit of survival mode and start thinking very personally about what they need to do for themselves, for their family, for their company, for their jobs, and think about the long-term impact. So the people who are then trying to resolve the issue have that additional pressure on them of all these human lives who are counting on them to figure out what went wrong, resolve it, and then after that happens, make sure it never happens again. And so if we step back to how did we get here, and we think about preparedness in real life, it is about thinking about every assumption we have, having plans in place for those assumptions, and then testing those plans. So when companies say, you know, we have data backups, have you ever tested that you can actually use your systems from those data backups? Or we have a business continuity plan, we know who we will call. Have you looked at that plan lately and made sure that those names are still accurate? Have you printed off those plans so that you have them handy in the event that there is no access online? Because we now store so many things online and feel that it's safer, that we don't have paper floating around and it's safe and it's secure. But when you don't have access to that online, what is your backup plan? So I would just say, Ali, all the things that we assume and all the backup plans that we have, we need to make sure that we're testing those and that they actually work.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly. And we'll make a note of that, and I'll go around the table also to get your perspective. Mark, one of the questions that came in from yesterday was, you know, we're into 24 hours or close to 24 hours. We still don't know with certainty if this is an incident or a breach or what has actually transpired. Is that a concern for you going into day 2?
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the root cause is when we get that information, because this is a very prolonged outage. It's getting into the territory that Kelly was alluding to, that this is no longer an inconvenience. This can put people in harm's way. This can cause a crisis, and without explanation, it only escalates that feeling of anxiety.
George, if I can just work with you a little bit on this, both Mark and Kelly have suggested this feeling of anxiety and nervousness in terms of how things are going to move forward. George, from your experience at this point, we've also touched last week on the role of government in providing support and services. At this point, we haven't yet seen a very direct involvement from a government perspective, but what we have seen is some guidance and some basic support on how to guide citizens. Do you feel that was enough, or there was more required?
I think we have to look at the fact that in the scenario of the outage, you had a massive amount of people without power for multiple hours. I think there should have been perhaps a more wide scale and immediate government response past a certain point. I mean, rarely do you see an outage outside of a very small localized area last longer than 1 hour, 2 hours. When you're getting that 4 hour, 6 hour, 8 hour range, you're getting into entire days. Very quickly, as Kelly pointed out, things descend into disorder and chaos very quickly. I mean, we saw this in previous examples during COVID when people were going crazy over toilet paper. There were massive lineups at the grocery stores, massive lineups at the shoppers, the convenience stores. You had, in some areas of violence and disorderly conduct in a fight for essential supplies. Now, I think that scarcity in that time was obviously misplaced, and there were supply chain issues, but not to the point that people had to go raid stores. But the fact is that people's minds will go there. So realistically, as part of a disaster recovery plan or an incident response plan for a national security level critical incident, there needs to be a government action plan that after a certain amount of time gets triggered. And I'm not saying it has to be the immediate full weight of pressure response right away. There should be an escalation, a triage process, but there needs to be greater leadership coming from a centralized authority figure in the capital, whether it be Toronto at the provincial level or Ottawa federally, being disseminated down to local organizations who are now taking coordinated orders and actions. We, I think for the sake of the exercise, did not put enough emphasis on that, because I would hope that if we actually had 70% of the province of Ontario without power, at the very least, the provincial government would be working with the municipalities to provide some sort of, one, communication, and two, essential survival services, right? If we get those two things in place, followed by three, basic policing, right? Where you're actually being like, hey, even if you are stuck at home, a lockdown's an option. Or at the very least, there are supplies that are arranged that are usually stored somewhere nearby so that there could be distribution of critical food, water, whatever it is. There has to be a fully thought out government action and response plan, because at the end of the day, people are going to turn to the government for help. If you are in government and you are in a state of disaster like this, maybe it's just a military attitude from my mind, but this is your time to shine. This is your time to take action and be there for the people that give you the mandate for you to have your job.
Thank you, George. And this is something we will come back to when we discuss the impact on utilities specifically. So Neil, thank you for joining us today. You probably received a quick recap of where we're at from a day one perspective. But one of the things that my co-host Mark brought up was collaboration and threat intelligence sharing amongst the utilities. And Mark mentioned something called Project Lighthouse, where in the coming few months, there will be a requirement to share some metadata of the different threats that you're seeing, etc. One gap that we saw yesterday was we didn't see other utility folks, utility companies come to the table. We didn't see a lot of threat intelligence and data sharing, and Rachel and Jack were emphasizing that needs to happen. Can you share some perspective on the challenges that you face in real time when trying to share intelligence?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that you talk about, threat intelligence, and those organizations which we're hoping can come together and share that information. It's maturity of their threat intelligence function, right? Do they have that ability internally to generate that and send it to a central body to consolidate? Oddly enough, when I think about an outage like this in this scenario, I date back to early 2000s when there was a Eastern Seaboard outage. And, George, I really liked how you tapped in to a couple things there, because there is precedence, in a way, to show what happened in terms of the chaos that ensued. Lineups at gas stations, right? Now, people treated it, some were a little bit more nonchalant about it, but those are the sort of things that you can use to kind of generate that plan. Sounding cliche, but proper preparation prevents poor performance. So that's what the key. So that threat intelligence piece, I mean, we're talking about technical when we associate that, but we have to learn from the past and use that as a way to inject learnings. Maybe a way that we would adjust what we do today. We soon forget those scenarios, right? So I would say that maturity of organizations, as well as leveraging some of the things from the past and in other geographies as well, to see how we can create those plans, create those responses that will take into consideration the public outcry, or public turning to government. But there's one thing just from personal experience, having gone through, incidents that have hit organizations and massive losses in terms of financially. But the key piece was the public outcry and managing that narrative. I cannot stress enough that, yes, you're going to get in the breach coaches. Yes, you're going to get the incident response people. But people overlook the importance of the PR function. If I can say that having the right folks and prepare that up front, so you're not starting from scratch, you're not deciding, how to say it, the tone you should use. That's an important piece, right? So I know I kind of digressed and straight off course, but hope that helps.
Sunil, given that you're coming into this day two, I'll tell you that the PR function was something that came up quite a bit. We had a dedicated session on crisis communications and public relations. So it's a very valid point, and even the comments you made on threat intelligence, very relatable. Jesse, I want to bring you into the conversation. Then we have 3 leaders that are online as well, and I'll weave them in, and Mark and Kelly, feel free to jump in. We have about 15 to 18 minutes to recap, so keep your perspective to the point, and then we'll go around the table. So Jesse, yesterday as we were reflecting back, and a couple of us went and sort of took everything into account, we didn't touch on the aspect of what the CISOs themselves at this time are going through. And we haven't, and we don't really go deeper into it, but if you were in that utility position of Northern Horizons Power Generation, which is the company that we've created for the purpose of this exercise, there's a certain level of liability and stress that now starts to kick in because you've been hit potentially, and there's talk about that.
Yes.
Imagine yourself in that situation. What's going through your mind as you're coordinating the response?
I think being in that position, the first thing that's going through your mind is, how big is this incident, right? That's the first thing, right? How big is the incident? What is it impacting? What other services could it impact? And how do we contain it, right? And how do we communicate that information to the businesses and the impact that it's going to have on, for example, if we're talking about utilities, what impact is it going to have health services? What impact is it going to have on transportation or public services? So I think the biggest thing is understanding what the threat is and how is it impacting our services, our emergency services, how is it impacting the users, and how to contain it. I think that's the first thing that would be going through my head at that point.
Jack, I'm going to come to you now with 2 comments that were made, both from Sunil as well as Jesse, and there's intelligence piece and the technicalities around it and how we share, etc. And then there's what's going through the mind of the CISO at this point of time. From your perspective as well, it's been one day. You know what you know about this breach or potential breach. You know the stress levels that are occurring across industry. With your eye from an insurance perspective as well, what's top of mind for you today, keeping in mind we're 24 hours into this outage now?
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a little bit about kind of the stress of the people, right? And everyone, 70% of the province being out of power, the other 30% are probably thinking, when are we going to get hit? So it really does come down, George talked about it as well, around communication, right? Out of the dozens, if not hundreds of events that I've unfortunately been a part of, communications is one of those things that is often neglected, either whether it's an internal, cross-functional, or outside to your key stakeholders. You need to keep that information flowing as much as you can, but obviously you don't want to over-communicate. So there's that balance that needs to be struck as far as what is the information that absolutely is critical. As Sunil said, hopefully a lot of this messaging has already been pre-packaged and just needs a little bit of tweaking for the specific event, and getting that out there. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is it's been 24 hours. If you're working on this event and you're feeling a little stressed, you should, right? This needs to get resolved as quickly as possible. Are the teams working on the right things? Are we focused too much on trying to figure out root cause? Are we getting on with restoring service first, threat ejection, and then looking at the broader sort of public sector and other infrastructure, even if this isn't a cyber event, there's now an opportunity.
But Jack, just very quickly, 30 seconds, and then I want to go to Sharifat and our folks that are online. Mark and I were discussing this last night, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot here, but again, we're focusing on action items. My concern right now is, from an insurance standpoint, which is the expertise that you have, yes, we'll be calling on our breach coaches, we'll be calling on incident responders, whatever supports we can get. Is your sector itself adequately prepared to deal with this outage to provide certain integrity and resiliency in their services?
I would say probably yes. I mean, we see this in other catastrophic events, right? This is a catastrophic event just like an earthquake is or a flood is, right? So there are mechanisms in place for insurance companies in general to bring people together in this sort of a crisis and get claims handled, people spoken to and reassured.
Fair enough. This is something we will tap into when we go into the discussion on financial services. So I appreciate, Jack, you providing that perspective. Sharifat, thank you for joining in for you. One of the sectors that we're going to be studying today is the financial services sector. Given that this outage is, as I've said repeatedly, 24 hours in, there's no real direction on when we will be back up with some sustainable perspective when it comes to impact on the financial sector of this outage and breach.
Thank you, Ali, for that question.
Okay.
And currently, what we are facing now is that most of our ATMs are down.
Sharifat, just give us.
Okay.
Yep, Sharifat, you could probably try your response again.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Can you hear me?
So we'll wait. We'll just very shortly, Sharifat. We'll come back to you. We're just not necessarily hearing you directly from our output over here. So just give it a few seconds. But I will turn to Amar first. Amar, as I'm working through, going through the question of impact of financial services with Sharifat, a question that I have for you is, you looked a lot yesterday on the managed services providers. You sort of walked through a lot of those areas. Did you find us missing anything in our response toolkit from yesterday? Anything specific like you have seen in our responses yesterday?
Well, that's an interesting question. We went through a lot, and there was a lot of information, and it was quite well done. But if there was one thing that, and Kelly did touch on it, but I think there should have been more emphasis on the people, the humanity of it, because families are now wondering what's going to happen. And you're mentioning financials. Well, there's no power. You can't go to the bank machine to get money out. How are you going to buy the groceries that you need to feed your family? So now there's a psychological piece that's really hitting the population, and to deal with that, especially, you've got young children, babies, how do I get formula for them? At the first 3 or 4 hours, you're like, but then now it's 24 hours, and how much longer is this going to be? What are we going to do, right? And the problem is, I think we all talk about pre-planning and having those plans, but we should also be talking about somehow getting that to the population to say, you might have pre-planned for a tornado, but now cybersecurity is also a threat and a risk. We should be pre-planning with the masses to ensure the safety and the protection of everyone.
And I think this is something that we have been looking at as well in terms of when we go into module 3 around the resiliency that needed to be built around this and the gaps that we identified. And I think the short-term and long-term requirements for citizens and understanding, if we go back to something that Stefan, my co-host yesterday, also mentioned, the equity of service and ensuring that we have action plans for each level. So thank you for that. Bruce Bay, today we're also, besides looking at the impact on financial services, we're looking at the impact on utility companies itself and other utility services providers across Canada. What do you think is top of mind for those utility companies around Canada at this point, as well as service providers in the US at this point, given the state we find ourselves in?
I think as a whole, as organizations, the spillover, the result of the outage and how that impacts, for example, delivery of water pumping, things of that nature, delivery of gas. But as cybersecurity professional, I think what's top on the mind is, are we going to be next? Is this a broader attack? Is somebody trying to make a geopolitical point here, and are we next in line? And how are we going to put the defenses up, put the elbows up, and make sure that we're ready for a hit, and perhaps even do some basic investigation to say, do we see any anomalies in our environment, in our network, in our systems that would point to a potential breach here? You did mention various types of surveillance and reconnaissance that the attackers had conducted. It'd be on top of mind to say, have you seen anything like that in our infrastructure, in our areas?
Sunil and Mark, I'll start off with you, Mark, and see Sunil's perspective. Mark, with your position within a utilities firm as well, if this does become classified as a nation-state attack, what will that do to your response? Will it change in any way? Perspective?
So something strange must be happening here to be 24 hours in and not to have publicized the root cause. That's normally in an outage situation, you get that within the first hour, like at the latest, because typically it's equipment failure, vehicle accident, down power line, storm, something that was more predictable. So this is something unique, which a nation-state style attack would be as well. And I don't know that many utilities have a plan for that specific instance. You would probably treat it similarly to how you would treat any successful cyber attack or other attack, and we would involve higher levels of government as soon as we realized what was going on. At this point, 24 hours in, that's probably already happened.
Sunil, your perspective?
Yes. So, the assumption is that you would involve government after a given time. I guess the question is, there's an opportunity here to define that. When is that time frame? Because I think there's going to be some intervention from the government. You know, like George mentioned, things like, do we have a curfew to prevent chaos? As Mark said, you know, it could be equipment failure, but at some point that you have to communicate what you do know to the public. In absence of that, you run the risk of, number one, not putting the public interest first. And secondly, you run the risk of what would be people assuming. And you know, that narrative, I keep on coming back to that, again, just from experience, was critical. The other piece I'll mention is that from a CISO's perspective, and we talked about the humanity aspect of it, but we forget high pressure situation for a CISO or a CSO. Leaders in those roles generally are under high pressure anyway, but I guess the fact is that the folks around him, the participants in that response team, both at a leadership and a technical perspective, need the opportunity for some downtime, dare I say it, or else mistakes will be made, things will be overlooked. Yeah. So yes, we all want to be heroes and run towards the fire. That's the nature of most people in security. But that's where you need some folks coming around and rallying and say, yeah, you need to go take that rest so you can refocus, right? So
I had a comment. That's right. I do actually, I think this really comes down to how we do training and preparation for these events. So when you have a TTX in an office environment, typically speaking, you do it for either 2 hours, 4 hours, or 8 hours. It's a one-day event. If we're going to talk about cycling like that, then you're talking about military-style preparatory training, where you're actually going through a organized scenario that takes place over multiple days, where you're actually 24/7 engaged on that location. Typically, if I was working in any sort of critical infrastructure organization and I was on the security team and we're preparing for an exercise like that, you kind of have to then look at, okay, do we have places for people to sleep in the facility? Do we have a way to feed people? Do we have an area for them to actually disengage and relax? Then you go through the actual preparatory cycle of like, okay, you're going to be on shift from this time to this time, then you're going to have this time to relax, then you're going to be doing something else from this time to this time, so they get used to what to mentally expect when going into that kind of crisis. I think you can hire security people with the understanding that they need to be calm, they need to be able to provide that leadership in a concise manner, but it's not sustainable over the period of a crisis if it's a multi-day or multi-week thing where they've never actually prepared to live and work through that kind of cycle. And how we actually do our preparation then is going to require a lot more investment in time and resources to be done correctly.
Sunil and then Jesse. Go ahead.
One of the things that I'll mention here, and I don't know if this was covered off yesterday, engaging with other providers, making sure that we understand what they're doing, how they can help us. And the reason why I say this, and there's another point to this where the government intervention is key. We all remember a little bit of an outage on one of the telecoms. We remember how the government just stepped in and says, you're mandated, you're going to have to back each other up, right? I think that those are things that should be put in place first, now, versus after, right? So these are the sort of things when we talk about government intervention, we really do need to think about those things up front, and that may be a small win in the plan. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Jesse?
Just to Sunil's point, you covered what I was going to say.
Oh, sorry.
Kind of put in position, the companies really, for example, utility companies, that kind of need to come together, create a cybersecurity task team where they share incidents or they share their ideas in terms of what's happening in their environment and kind of create a plan and, come up with I think right now nothing is being shared. If there are incidents, sometimes they're just pushed under the rug, because they don't want to expose themselves, or it's just, again, reputation. There's a lot of other factors that they're looking at. I think there has to be a secret task force that is working on these cybersecurity incidents and collaborating and sharing that information. And I think on the other side, we're talking about, having these tabletop exercises that we're running in our organizations. We're not looking at the things that George talked about, right? Having that breaks, having those interventions where team is told to kind of take that time off, relax. Anytime there has been an incident, I think everyone's on deck, full force, 24/7, trying to contain that incident at that point. I don't think anyone's really thinking of taking a rest at that point, but it's an important piece of it, and it needs to be incorporated into your cybersecurity plans. And I don't think organizations have thought about that or put it in place at this point.
Yeah, and Rhonda did mention this from her municipal perspective, and so too did Kajiban, around ensuring that you have enough staff and you've allocated it across a sustainable time period to ensure that you have a consistent response and support. So thank you for that. We have about 2 minutes left. Kelly, I'll start off with you for a closing comment. One of the things that then Jussie referenced as well was the collaboration from other partners, especially third parties, MSPs, etc. Do you really feel that all of the MSPs are well positioned to work together? In a scenario like this, will silos again begin to translate further?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think people come together naturally to help each other, whether that's formalized in a way to encourage it in advance instead of in the moment. I would say probably not. I've seen with power outages that certain electrical distributors actually send their people to another area. So when there's a storm, when there's a major outage, it happens, but it happens through relationships and goodwill as opposed to through advanced partnerships and any kind of formal agreements. And so you can say it actually feels better when people are doing it because they realize they should instead of being forced to do it. However, in the event like this, where it's major and it's 70% of people being without power, that goodwill probably isn't enough. So I think we need to be careful that we don't mandate things in a way that we break the partnerships, the goodwill, the people that want to help each other, but that we support that type of relationship that's already been built among the utilities.
Thank you, Kelly. Mark, closing comments from your end. It's a pressing question that I think a lot of folks watching will have. Do you see this attack escalating in any way?
If it's an attack, absolutely, because it must have done enough damage that disclosure of the root cause is still being figured out. So something may have been severely damaged. It could be physical damage caused by the attack. And if the attack is that sophisticated, there's no way there's not a next step to this.
Okay. Thank you, Mark, and thank you everybody around the table for joining us for this opener to day 2. I'll be back in approximately 15 minutes as we dive into our next session, which is the impact on financial markets. Thank you once again for joining, and we'll see you very shortly.